think as many years as I've studied theology, as many times as I've read the Bible, as many talks on the faith as I've heard, it's easy for me to fall prey to the temptation to think that I've largely heard everything there is to hear theologically. And so it was with a certain amount of astonishment and delight that last week I learned something completely and entirely new from an episode of The Chosen, of all places, that they depicted the apostles and disciples offering a prayer in the days leading up to the Passover that I had never heard before. And as I was watching it, I thought, no, they are 100% making this up. And then I did some research and realized I was 100% wrong. But it was a powerful prayer. The prayer was called the Dayenu. And it's a prayer that reminds the people of Israel of all of the good things that God had done for them. And not merely the things that he had done, but the realization that each of them were so impressive, that each of them were so extraordinary and unnecessary on God's part, that had God done any one of these things for them, it would have been enough to merit their worship. And yet God did all of those things for them. That had God simply brought them salvation once, or had God brought justice against their persecutors even once, that would have been more than enough to prove his love. But that he did it for them over and over and over again. And I think it's a temptation for us in all of the bad news that we get, and in all of the challenges that we face, to focus our attention on the places where we don't think that God is acting, where we wonder about the places where it seems like God is taking his pretty sweet time, and we wish that he were moving a little faster than he is. All of the places where we wonder why God has allowed something to persist. But there's a great danger in that it causes us to lose sight of all the places where God has acted, all of the places where God is acting, and all of the places where God intends to continue to act, and to show gratitude for that. And so it's a short enough and a beautiful enough prayer that I want to actually just offer it here. And from what I read online and from the context of the episode of The Chosen, it was really a hymn that it was meant to be sung, and each stanza to be taken by a different person around the table as they all took part in praising God and being reminded of the goodness that he had shown them. And it went like this. If God had taken us out of Egypt and not passed judgment on them, it would have been enough. If God had passed judgment on them but had not passed judgment on their gods, it would have been enough. If God had passed judgment on their gods and had not killed their firstborn, it would have been enough. If God had killed their firstborn and had not given us their treasure, it would have been enough. If God had given us their treasure and had not parted the Red Sea for us, it would have been enough. If God had parted the Red Sea for us, but had not taken us through it on dry land, it would have been enough. If he had taken us through it on dry land and had not drowned our enemies in the sea, it would have been enough. If he had drowned our enemies in the sea and had not supplied our needs in the desert for 40 years, it would have been enough. If he had supplied our needs in the desert for 40 years, but had not fed us the manna, it would have been enough. If he had fed us the manna and had not given us the Sabbath, it would have been enough. If he had given us the Sabbath and had not brought us to Mount Sinai, it would have been enough. If he had brought us to Mount Sinai but had not given us the Torah, the scriptures, it would have been enough. If he had given us the scriptures but had not brought us into the land of Israel, it would have been enough. If he had brought us into the land of Israel but had not built us the temple, it would have been enough. That as often as we're tempted to ask God why he isn't doing one thing or another, the days when we're tempted to wonder why God doesn't just let us give him counsel for an hour and make sure that he takes good notes because we know how to solve all the world's problems, it's good for us to remember all of the things that God has done and all of the stuff that he intends to keep doing for us. And we could probably and fairly easily come up with our own Catholic version of that. That if God had died on the cross for us and had not given us baptism, it would have been enough. That if God had given us baptism but had not forgiven our sins in confession, it would have been enough. That if God had forgiven my sins in confession the first time but hadn't forgiven my sins in confession the second time, it would have been enough. That if God had forgiven my sins in confession the second time but not the third time, it would have been enough. I could keep going, but I'm not going to. We have places to be today. That God is far better to us than we deserve. And not only has God proven his love to us in the past, he continues to do it in the present, and he intends to keep doing it in the future. And it's important for us to recognize his generosity because it's the recognition of that love that moves us to love ourselves. In our gospel today, we're presented with the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think there's a temptation for us as Catholics, just like there is for me when it comes to theology, to think that we have heard this passage so many times that we know exactly what Jesus is teaching us here, that we know what he's saying. And I would argue, I'm willing to bet, because it was at least this way for me for a good portion of my life, that actually the way that we take this passage is the reverse of the way that Jesus actually intends it in one of the primary messages that he's getting across to us. And let me explain. What happens in this gospel passage? The scribe answers Jesus' question in response to his own question, and he tells them that the law is summed up in the double law of love, that you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus tells them, well done, bravo, go and do this and you will live. And then we're told that the scribe, to justify himself, asks, who is my neighbor? That presumably the scribe sees himself in the place of generosity, that he sees himself as the privileged party, as the one who needs to be loving his neighbor as himself in act, which is not a bad thing insofar as it goes. But Jesus does an interesting thing in how he replies to this question. Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, and most of us are familiar. A man is on his way to Jericho. He is beaten, robbed, stripped of his clothes, and left naked and half dead on the side of the road, presumably to end there. And a few people walk by the man and see him in this sorry state. First is the priest, who moves to the other side of the road lest he become ritually unclean by touching this man. And to be sure, because the man is naked, and you could most easily tell apart your friends from your foes by the way they dressed, he wasn't really sure whether or not this guy was one of his people or their people, and it was best just not to dirty his hands with it altogether. A Levite comes by and does the same. Finally, the Good Samaritan comes by, and we know what happens next, that he dresses his wounds, he binds them, brings the man to an inn, and not only takes care of him up until that point, but actually leaves money for his future care, and then promises that when he comes again, if the debt has not been squared by the extra money that he leaves, that he will pay for whatever additional care was necessary to bring the man back to health. That the Good Samaritan goes far above and beyond what the circumstances demand of him. That had he even dressed the man's wounds, you could say it would have been enough. Had he simply brought the man to the inn, it would have been enough. Had he left the money for the man's future care, it certainly would have been enough. Had he only promised on his way back to cover whatever additional fees had been incurred, it certainly would have been enough. That the Good Samaritan shows far more compassion and generosity with the man than circumstances demand of him. And then after Jesus shares this parable, he does an interesting thing in the question he asks the scribe, because we have to remember what the scribe himself asked. He said, "Who is my neighbor?" Who are the people I actually have to worry about caring for, and who are the people I don't need to? And Jesus turns the question around and he says, "Who was the victim's neighbor?" And the scribe answers, "The one who treated him with mercy." And Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." And so the way that this passage is often taken, which is a correct interpretation of it, is, yes, you now go be the Good Samaritan and show love to people around you, whether or not they're on your team. You go and give without counting the cost. But one of the fascinating things, and Jesus can do this because he's God, so he can get across 100 messages with just a handful of words, is that Jesus actually flips the roles that are played in this parable when he answers the scribe's question. That the scribe asks, "Who is my neighbor?" and Jesus answers and tells him who is the neighbor of the beaten man. The implication being that the scribe asks the question thinking that he is the party who is going to benefit someone else. And Jesus looks at the scribe and says, You poor silly man, you don't even get that you're the dead man on the side of the road. You're not the Good Samaritan. You're the man who's been beaten and left to die. I'm the Good Samaritan. I'm the one who found you as I was walking along, and in spite of the fact that I owed you nothing because you were an enemy of mine, I took care of you. I paid extra money for your future care, and I promised to come back and check on you and make sure you were well. That Jesus is commanding generosity and Christian charity on our part, but he's also reminding us that in the roles in this parable, we are not primarily the Good Samaritan, that we're actually the one who's received the love of the Good Samaritan. That you and I are the beaten man, that we're the ones who received love first, that in all of the places in our lives where we've needed God, and all of the places in our lives where we have been spiritually impoverished, maybe socially impoverished, financially impoverished, emotionally or intellectually impoverished, that God has seen us through those and provided for our needs. That in spite of all of the crosses that each of us have had to carry, every one of us has made it safely to this day today. That Jesus has seen us through that. And if you and I are not healthy yet, if in spite of everything that God has done in the past and is doing for us now, we are still broken, then Jesus has promised that he's going to continue coming back and paying the debt until you and I are healthy again, until we get up, walk, and leave that inn. That Jesus is promising that while him giving us baptism was enough, he also gave us confession. That while him giving us confession once was enough, he gave it to us 40,000 times. That Jesus is here to do as much as he needs to do to make us well. And it's only when we understand that you and I are able to show the love with the fervor that we need to be the Good Samaritan ourselves now. To be the one who's in a place to give generously rather than to receive. That the scribe asked the question to distance himself from the dirty and the outcast, and Jesus said, you don't get it, you are the dirty and the outcast, bud. And yet I made sure that you were well. So how about you turn around and do the same? And so as we gather at the sacrifice of the Mass, we rejoice in all the stuff that God has done for us. That as easy and as tempting as it is to look at all of the dark corners of this world, to look at all of the places in which our beautiful world is broken and defective because of sin, and to ask God, where are you and why aren't you doing something about this? We have to constantly keep our eyes focused on all the stuff that he has done something about. And be assured that he is continuing to do stuff about that his Holy Spirit is at work in our world, and that he will continue to be at work in our world until he comes again and he makes us well in eternity. That the parable of the Good Samaritan calls each of us to love our neighbor as ourself, to be a good Samaritan for those that we meet. But we find the power and the strength to be a good Samaritan by recognizing that Jesus was the Good Samaritan first.